Uh-oh.
Okay, Barbara, we're live.
Good afternoon, everyone, or rather good evening. I'm so pleased to be able to host Professor Emeritus Richard White in his, do I want to call it daring book? Anyway, Who Killed Jane Stanford, which I think is super exciting to be discussing. Richard is the author of Railroaded, winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and a Pulitzer Prize finalist, and the Margaret Byrne Professor Emeritus at Stanford University, which he tells me only allows him parking privileges and he can use the library, which has shattered my image of what a professor emeritus actually gets to do. So on the screen with us, underneath me, is Professor Paul Goldstein from the law school, who's a killer novelist as well, with, I think, is it 3 books or 4, Paul?
Well, actually, it's 5 right now.
5. Oh, that's right. And didn't you win the Harper
Lee Prize for Legal Fiction? Yeah,
that's right. So he's the winner of the Harper Lee Prize for Legal Fiction, and I hope, has a novel in progress. Is that also true?
exactly. I was talking with my agent about it today. Yeah.
Splendid. And Angie Kim, who is with us, is the author of a fabulous book, and I keep hoping, actually working on a new book. Are you, Angie?
I am. In fact, I'm finishing it up right now.
Wonderful. Missing from our screen, but probably coming back, is Francine Matthews, another Stanford graduate who was a CIA analyst turned novelist and is the author of more books than I can count under the name Francine Matthews and Stephanie Barron. And annoyingly, she needs to come back because I was going to have her actually talk about Stephen White, Richard's brother, who is the person that brought this book to our attention. And we may have Robert Dugoni popping in from another thing. But anyway, Richard, who killed Jane Stanford? Are you going to tell us?
I'm sure it's going to come out over the course of the conversation. I will come down to the very end. I certainly tell you in the book. And the book is about how Jane Stanford's murder was covered up for over 100 years, and in some ways still continues to be covered up to this day, as much about as it is about who actually killed her. Whoops, this is my great fear of this stuff. Excuse me, let me get rid of this. That's the person who's emptying my house calling me. So Jane Stanford was murdered. But what's interesting is she was poisoned twice. It's only the second poisoning that actually killed her. She was poisoned first on January 14th, 1905 in her bedroom in her mansion at Nob Hill. And then she was poisoned again on February 28th, 1905, when she was trying to flee the first poisoner by going to Hawaii 6 weeks later. The coroner's jury at the time knew she'd been poisoned. The coroner's jury said she had met death at the hands of persons or persons unknown and said she had died of strychnine poisoning. The university denied that relatively quickly. The president of the university came to Hawaii, said in fact she had died of a heart attack, took her body back. The police of San Francisco then buttressed his account, and the murder, while it never disappeared totally from the press, faded from public consciousness largely because of the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, which destroyed evidence and turned everybody's attention elsewhere. In 2003, a Stanford University physician, Robert Cutler, published a book which he went back over the autopsy. He discovered the original autopsy results in Hawaii, went back over them in ways I couldn't do. He was a physician, and he said the evidence was very clear. She had died of strychnine poisoning, and the university's account of her death was patently false. So my problem in the book is not just who killed her and why, but why the university covered up her murder for over 100 years and still is unwilling to talk about it today. That's a dual story. It's a story of an institution, which I think in the end becomes thoroughly corrupt by its attempts to cover up the murder and to figure out why in the world it would do that. And secondly, the suspects. And the suspects turned out to be multiple. The university's account was always she was the good woman. That's what she's called. And the good woman had no people who would be interested in killing her. There was absolutely no reason for anyone to kill Jane Stanford. She was a philanthropist. She was religious. She was giving all of her money away. Why would anybody kill her? My problem became I not only found one person who had a motive for killing her or two people who had a motive for killing her, I found half a dozen people who had a motive for killing her. There were a lot of people who hated Jane Stanford, and most of them had a very good reason. The other thing that brought them all together, besides being suspects in the murder case, is they all worked for Jane Stanford. Everybody, in fact, worked for Jane Stanford. Her relatives worked for Jane Stanford. The faculty on the university worked for Jane Stanford. Her servants worked for Jane Stanford. Everybody worked for Jane Stanford. And at this point in trying to figure it out, I found ways in which old detective novels and what I was trying to do in this book began to merge together. There was a line when I was rereading Dashiell Hammett, and I was rereading Dashiell Hammett because so many of the books are set in San Francisco. And at the beginning of Maltese Falcon, Sam Spade turns to his client and says, "Suppose you tell me about it from the beginning, and then we'll know what needs doing. Better begin as far back as you can." As far back as you can, in my case, went to the death of Leland Stanford Jr., for whom the university is named. Leland Stanford and Jane Stanford's founding of the university, they were the co-founders, and their attempts to steer the university towards first a vision of a practical university, and then a much stranger vision when Jane Stanford took over after her husband's death in 1892, which lasted her reign over the university lasted until 1905, in which she turned it towards spiritualism. At various points, she thought she was going to turn it over to the Catholic Church. She was the one who had first brought in undergraduate women. It was a co-ed university, very unusual at the time. And by the end of her life, she was doing her best to drive women out of the university. She spent much of the end of her life in a full sexual panic that women were going to corrupt men at the university, and we either had to establish a separate campus or simply banish women. And the board of trustees and the president of the university were desperately trying to appease her as she took more and more draconian measures to surveil women students. At the same time, she created a legal nightmare, and her husband helped in this, in that most of the trusts and the wills and the grants to Stanford University were contrary to the law. George Crothers, who becomes a man who really becomes her confidant and always thought she was murdered no matter what Stanford says, tried to steer those documents so that he could cover up all of their deficiencies. What he ended up doing, which is very unusual for a university, there's an amendment to the California Constitution which exists only to legalize Stanford University. For all practical purposes, legally speaking, in the 1890s and the early 20th century, there was no there for Stanford. Anybody who had challenged the funding and founding of the university could have pushed it over, which terrifies Crothers, because a lot of people have motive for doing this. And that if Jane Stanford's wills and trusts can be broken, that money can be distributed elsewhere to her family, to the Catholic Church, to other people who she put into the wills. As she begins by 1904, 1905 to become more and more convinced that she's vision of the university is being betrayed, particularly by David Starr Jordan, and she's right, it is, she decides what she's going to do is dismiss Jordan after she gets back from Hawaii, that he will be fired, and Jordan knows about this, and that she will now turn the university towards what she sees as its vision, which is to promote a spiritualist doctrine called soul germ theory, in which the university will be used to educate people for a higher life after they die, all of which contradicts the charter of the university and is blatantly illegal. Somebody's trying to kill her, and it could have been people in the university, but it also could have been servants. Servants are embezzling money from her and are afraid they're going to be caught. Servants are in her will, and they wish that she would die before she changes her will. And Bertha Berner, who is her closest confidant, has a very sick mother, but finds herself being drawn away by Jane Stanford on her world trips, including a trip from Hawaii, which was supposed to go on to Japan. Bertha Berner also is a woman who has worked for Stanford since she was 19 years old. And Jane Stanford, just as with undergraduate women, thinks that she can control Bertha Berner's body, her relationships, who she sees, and how she sees them. They have, even though Bertha Berner denies it in her memoir, a very fraught relationship in which Bertha Berner leaves and comes back multiple times. She too is going to have a motive for killing Jane Stanford, because if she goes on that trip, if she follows all the way to Japan, she will leave her own mother dying, and her mother will die in July of 1905. So a lot of people have a motive for killing her. As it turns out, for me, figuring out who actually did kill her, the key to killing her, to catching the murderer, lies in some relatively small details. And one of the things that during COVID just kept me up at night thinking about it was, how do you go from trying to murder a woman by pouring copious amounts of rat poison in her Poland Spring bottled water in January in Nob Hill, to putting almost the minimum amount of strychnine necessary to kill her and distributing it in such a way that if it's taken as she usually takes her bicarbonate of soda, the evidence will disappear. Somebody changed a great deal. Either there were two murderers, which I don't believe, or the murderer learned an awful lot in between. As I went through it, there were all kinds of obvious clues to me, and the police weren't neglecting them. One of the things I began to realize as I went through, that unless these policemen were incredibly stupid, they had a series of leads that they absolutely refused to follow. They were corrupt. I have no doubt about that. They were very corrupt. They were tied in with organized crime in San Francisco, but they were not stupid. And then I realized that, in fact, they had identified the murderer. They'd identified at least the person who aided the murderer. And that person who I was able to follow for 10 years, all through the records in Mountain View, in Palo Alto, in San Francisco, at the moment where he gets involved in the Jane Stanford murder, disappears, absolutely disappears. He's gone from the records. He also had been already involved in embezzling, and so he should have been able to stick around and certainly should have ended up in police court, but he is gone. So in the end, I turned back to Stanford's motives, and Stanford's motives for covering up the Jane Stanford's death were quite willingly, nobody wanted to go into those wills and trusts. The more attention those wills and trusts got, the worse it was going to look for Stanford. If they identified the murderer and the murderer actually knew anything about Stanford University, a whole lot of things that everybody wanted to keep hidden were going to come out. So there's a lot of motives there. The other thing there is, well, you could have said, well, Jane Stanford committed suicide. But the problem with suicide is to avoid the wills. At the time, taking your own life means that you are incapable of actually signing in a legal document, knowing what you're doing. So suicide is out. Murder is a problem. What they can do is say, if she didn't die of murder or suicide, but just died a natural death, then everything is good. And what happened was David Starr Jordan was the one who arranged the fact that the murderer would change her story. At this point, I clearly identify her, or I don't clearly, but it's one of the suspects. And by doing so, she and David Starr Jordan have a murder of convenience. Stanford University survives. She survives. Jane Stanford is dead. Burying Jane Stanford, in the end, probably saves Stanford University. And one of the ironies is Jane Stanford's funeral. Many of the leading people who are walking behind her casket as it goes to the mausoleum on Stanford campus were people who were either suspects in her murder or people who worked to cover up her murder.
Well, thank you. That is really a wonderful summary. Angie, what did you want to say?
No, I didn't. I wanted to ask a question because it was just so fascinating. I just wanted to see, like, I don't know that it's relevant any longer, but I just thought that one of Stanford University's, motives in trying to cover this up and not letting any questions come about is also that, she's a matriarch in this, in this rich history, and they wouldn't want there to be any, questions about her likability, right? Like, we don't want unlikable people who are in our history as the founders and, people who established this great university. So I wondered if that was part of the motive as well.
It's the motive, what happens immediately after the cover-up. I mean, one of the things is they start praising her as soon as she's dead.
Sure.
Particularly, these are ministers, many of whom she'd fired, many of whom regarded her as an autocrat, but everything turns around and she becomes exactly as you said. She's a good woman. She lost a son. She adopted the children of California. And that, in fact, she devoted her great wealth for educating the children of California and for founding a great university, which is exactly the line Stanford University uses down to the present day. So you're perfectly right. This becomes the founding story. And having her be somebody who has multiple people had reason to murder her, made a lot of enemies, and was about to take the money away from the university is not such a good founding story.
So Paul, all this legal stuff, what comments do you want to make? You're the legal brain in this operation.
Yeah, well, I'll leave the legal point for a moment. One of the things I loved about this book were the details and the personalities. You really used a novelist's skills in bringing out the personalities. And for me, the hero of the story, I suspect, Richard, you won't agree, is George Crothers.
Yeah.
I suspect because she was a lawyer. You have this wonderful line. I had to put a post-it here talking about what George Crothers said publicly often was not what he thought privately. He was not so much a hypocrite as a lawyer. And that I just thought was a wonderful line. But Crothers wasn't the only one whom you brought to life. So I just enjoyed the novelistic aspect of the book. I also found contemporary resonance in your treatment of the newspapers, your description of the newspapers, which, that was another age. I hadn't realized there were so many newspapers in operation in San Francisco and in Oakland, and how susceptible they were to corruption, to pressure from individuals they may side with, and then another newspaper would oppose the call or whatever because they were the competition. And it made me think of social media and all the complaints that are made about Twitter and Facebook and the like, how irresponsible they are. Well, I don't think that the press at the turn of the last century was much more responsible than the platforms that we're dealing with today. Finally, Barbara, to turn to your point, I'm less persuaded about the specific impact of the murder on Stanford's motives in the cover-up. Now, clearly there was a cover-up. Why else does David Starr Jordan take was a 6-day trip, boat trip to Hawaii? And I'm not sure that the murder in the way it would have impacted the grants in the way that suicide would, which I take. And I really go with Angie's observation. All is for the best and the best of all possible worlds. She is the founding mother. She is the matriarch. Who could hate this heart? You painted a truly dreadful person. She emerges as such. And I just think it's the gloss in large part of we don't want to have a murdered founder. That just doesn't ring true. And as you said, Richard, this continues to the present day as part of the Stanford affect.
Wow, I never thought I'd hear you quote Candide in this conversation. I'm really impressed.
I beg your pardon?
I didn't think you'd ever quote Candide in this conversation. The best of all possible worlds. Whatever. Francine, it's delightful to have you back. What's your reaction? We can't hear you.
I said I joined by phone because my computer has no connection, and I'm so sorry. I've been frantically kind of tinkering with the engineering in the background. What I loved, Richard, I have to tell you, is the whole section you wrote about her campaign against sort of professorial freedom of speech and the ways in which her efforts to stifle that and actively fire anybody who was contrary to her kind of philosophy, contributed to Stanford's lowered profile among university presidents. You know, you mentioned Harvard and this sort of weighing in of this is not the way we treat academic freedom. I got a real sense of Stanford as a sort of stepchild, as a boutique university, as something that was the pet project of a wealthy couple that didn't quite achieve what American academia at the time considered legitimacy. And I found that fascinating when you look at where Stanford is today.
Yeah. Modern Stanford is a creation of post-World War II. And David Starr Jordan, who was an equally horrible person, but was also right when he talked about Jane Stanford's money went into what they called the Stone Age. The building of the Memorial Church, the building of the museum, which was to house Leland Jr.'s collections, the building of the Memorial Arch, the building of the mausoleum. And again, the book is full of ironies. The 1906 earthquake destroyed all of those things. Memorial Arch is gone. The pillars are still there. The modern church is no longer the church Jane Stanford built. The whole steeple came tumbling down. Most of the things that she set up as memorials to the family were destroyed, which then creates this other myth that the Stanfords were so self-effacing that there's no memorial to Jane Stanford or Leland on campus, and so we have to rename Father Sarah Way, which was originally selected by Jane Stanford, who idolized Sarah, into Jane Stanford Way, when in fact the whole university was a memorial originally to Jane Stanford, Leland Jr., and Leland Stanford.
And Leland, right.
So let me tell you, as the senior member of this crew, two things that I wanted to talk about. One, you're right, that Stanford is a creation to a great degree post-World War II. When I arrived there, the university had a terrific asset, which was it had land. It had a big campus. And what they decided to do, which I thought was incredibly clever, was they built a lot of great faculty housing and so forth. And then they went back east. And they said to professors there who were not being paid terribly well, that they could come to California, they could have faculty housing for free, they would have, more money, this, that, and the other thing. And basically they did a raid on the Ivy League schools.
Barbara, when were you there? I'm just
1958, I graduated in 62, and then I stayed on for more. But that whole thing was going on while I was there. And it was, in many ways, revolutionary, and the university was really proud of the idea, that they had discovered a way to bring Eastern academic talent to California, basically by using their great asset, which was property. They also started building the medical, the medical school, and then the whole business. I'm trying to remember what they call it, but when I graduated, I had a job with William Shockley. I was actually a secretary. He was, was it a Nobel Prize? Is that what he won? But anyway, he was trying to establish Shockley Electronics in the industrial part. So they were developing part of the campus. And what they did was they had 99-year rents. It's actually a really British model to do that. Paul, you're probably more familiar with that than I am, but they built all this stuff and they leased it out and they kept the land.
Yeah, I live in one of those houses you described that actually belonged to two generations, the Gerards, on the campus, and we built the house in 1928. But yes, our lease will be running out probably another 40 years. I'm not worried about that.
Oh my God, it's hilarious.
Yeah, I will tell you though, you're absolutely right about it, and Richard makes the point that the Stanford we know today is a post-World War II product by far. And when I arrived at Columbia Law School in 1964, the people there, the students there were saying, you came at the wrong time. The four most important people on the faculty just 2 years ago decamped for Stanford. for Stanford Law School, and that was just part of the East Coast raid.
Yeah, it really was the raid. The other thing, and I'm so glad to have read your book, Richard, because it was always murky in my mind. But just to illustrate the force that Jane Stanford and her will was still exerting, when I arrived in 1958, there were all sorts of rules for women that I could not believe. One of which is that we were not allowed to do anything but wear dresses on campus. And if you tried to vary that, if you wanted to go out in pants to go to class, they would stop you. And they would say, Mrs. Stanford's will, we can't overturn it. We had to have a 10 o'clock curfew. We had to live in separate dormitories. We weren't allowed to pick our roommates. It was a lottery system. And all of that, every time you would challenge that or think, God, this, no alcohol either. Absolutely no alcohol in the dorm. You could be thrown out of the university if you did that. And
I
every
think that
time
might be true.
anybody-
I think that might be true now. The no alcohol in dorms now. I think we've reverted back. I hope. I think, as the mom of several. Two kids who are in college, but anyway,
But Barbara, what strikes me about that is something else, which is that as someone who went to Princeton in 1981, when Princeton had only been admitting women for 10 years, what this speaks to is that actually Stanford was far more progressive than East Coast Ivies in being coeducational. And one of the interesting things that I thought Richard brought up was that Jane Stanford was considering getting rid of women undergraduates in her lifetime. And that was a step backward. At least you were there. In a way that I remember in researching my book, Jack 1939, looking at Jack Kennedy going to Stanford for half a year for a semester in business school, after he left Harvard. And it was the first time in his life he had been in a coeducational environment. And I found that fascinating. That was in 1940. Stanford was ahead of its time in that regard. And in a way, the fact that you were even there is kind of revolutionary, even though you had all these strictures on your life.
It actually wasn't the strictures that threw me, although, the women were a very small part of the undergraduate makeup. Even though we were there, we were very small in number. It was the constant references to Mrs. Stanford's will that were the problem. It was like this thing was,
the dead hand.
There was so much overt worry on the part of the administration that somehow or other we would violate some part of Mrs. Stanford's will and then throw the whole university into jeopardy. It was that sort of overhanging cloud that I found to be bizarre, not the rules themselves.
Right.
So interesting, because I was none of you guys look at the age that one would expect for the years that you guys are throwing around. So there's that. But I was in undergrad. I was a freshman in 87. And I have to say, haven't heard anything about this. I've never even heard of Jane Stanford. I don't remember hearing about Jane Stanford. There was quite a bit of drinking, so maybe I blocked it out. Maybe all the alcohol, deleted it from my brain cells. But I have not heard anything about this. So I remember when Barbara reached out to me, I was like, what is this controversy? This is so fascinating, because I hadn't heard about it. So I think it's so interesting that somewhere between sort of the 60s and the 80s, it sort of got, that line got sort of, we overcame some kind of line. And I guess today I'm wondering, Richard, what kind of, I'm fascinated to know what kind of response you've gotten from the campus, from the administration, from the student body. Is this being treated as like a true crime type of thing? Or is it, being treated more as a historical account? Like I'd love to know, or like historical fiction or something. I'd love to know what the response has been.
Well, around the campus and in the Bay Area, there's been a response which is partially like yours. They had no idea this ever took place.
Right, yeah.
But on campus, I mean, I got a call from the San Francisco Examiner. A reporter said she wanted to do a story on Stanford administration's response to my book. And I said, it's going to be a really short story because not only haven't they said anything, they're not going to say anything. I taught in Utah for a while, and Utah would deal with these kinds of attacks was against the Mormon church or these stories by just ignoring it, waiting for it to go away. So there's been absolutely no response from Stanford, nor do I expect there to be any response from Stanford. Stanford just wants it all to go away. After all, Cutler in 2003 wrote a book which didn't sell very well, it's true, but pretty much established beyond doubt that Jane Stanford had been poisoned. The university waited it out, tried to attach it to a bunch of other critics who were floating some fairly crazy ideas, and then just let the whole thing fade away. And when this class started as teaching an undergraduate seminar to get them to use the archives, and the students who came in to do it had heard nothing about this. And that's best for Stanford. Stanford doesn't want this known at all.
So Paul, as a faculty member, what do you think the faculty response would be to this, if any?
That this is history. And I wouldn't, I have a hard time understanding why Stanford would want to continue the cover up. This was well over a century ago. It was truly, an ugly founding moment. I mean, Richard, what you described was just in so many ways unpleasant. And the faculty politics that were going on with Julius Goebel, and whom I had a great deal of sympathy as you portrayed him. But this was over 100 years ago, and what should the university be concerned about today in terms of continuing a cover-up? You make a very convincing case that there was a cover-up in and around 1905. But what would the university's motives today be? Particularly as Angie said, this is all unknown. Nobody really cared about it in the 80s or the 90s, and really until you published the book. It's history, which is important to know what the founding moment looked like. But why should there be a concern not to applaud you today for uncovering this?
Well, in part because there's a through thread, and in part because I asked for it. One of the themes of the book is the problem with philanthropy is philanthropists.
Right.
And that once you start looking at where this money comes from and the conditions that are made with this money, and I can show it to you about the first founder, and my suspicion, the question I leave open, I don't think it's, if you go through the names that are being put on buildings now, there is going to be a whole lot of very similar questions of the origin of the money, the strings that are attached to the money, how the university itself will begin to shape itself around those who are willing to give it money. That, I think, is what they're scared of. It's not the original scandal. It's the through thread. It's the problem with philanthropy and founding institutions like this.
Very interesting. The Sackler problem, right, which has been a fairly big one. So my thesis is that when this sort of whole thing about Mrs. Stanford will and the rules that were prevalent when I was an undergraduate, my sister followed me to Stanford 3 years after so I was a senior when she was a freshman. And the overseas campus program began, and she was accepted. Only Stuttgart was open when I was there. But before I graduated, there was a campus in Tours, and there was a capital in Florence. And the stringent rules that Mrs. Stanford had set out could not be made to operate in the overseas campus environment. And so that, I think, is what quietly changed it all. So if you came to Stanford in the late 60s, let's say, by then, the experience that I had would have dissipated because it would have changed. And I'm pretty sure I remember some conversations about how they had to actually do some sort of action with her will in order to open the overseas campus because it did violate some of the rules that she had set out. I mean, I have a fairly hazy memory of this. It was a very long time ago, but that's what sticks in my mind.
Yeah, which would be ironic because Jane Stanford herself violated every single rule that was set up to govern the university.
Well,
But you point out, Richard, you point out, Richard, in your whole study of sort of the governing foundational concepts, that none of them were valid, right?
Right.
It's all the whole Leland Stanford project of establishing the university, even before his death, was flawed by his presumption of what he could do versus California law. And so there's this sense of illegitimacy underlying the founding of the university and its early years that I think partly informs their desire to cover up her death, that there's this whole weird nouveau riche upstart kind of unlawful aspect to the founding of Stanford that the university would like to bury, and it extends into Jane Stanford's murder, but it originates in the whole project to actually create the university itself.
That's, I mean, even George Crothers, which I agree becomes one in a book that doesn't have a whole lot of sympathetic figures. He can count as a sympathetic figure, but what he knows is how rotten the foundation is, and he doesn't want any looking at it. And the Stanfords were people, and I think your description of them is nouveau riche. Jane Stanford did not make much distinction between running the university and running her own household. She would often draw the parallel. Yeah, these are people she can hire. These are people she can fire. These are people whose lives she's going to control. She is going to determine what goes on in her house. And that particularly when, and I think a lot of the sexual panic comes from Leland Stanford died on the verge of puberty. And so the idea of, she believed, first think that in one of the incidents, which I think I describe as both creepy and touching, she stalked George Crothers as an undergraduate because he looks like Leland Stanford Jr. She follows him around in a carriage. And her idea is that having undergraduate women and having any sort of sexual attraction on campus endangers what she thinks, and she uses these words, the purity of her son. And at one point she says, even if I could have him back, I wouldn't have him because he left while he was still pure. So weird things are going on when you're trying to run co-eds and male students at the same time, a co-educational institution. So this is, I think part of the undertone here, but the other part is just simply the financial basis is so strange. Charles Eliot of Harvard at one time says nothing that happens at Stanford can really influence American higher education as a whole, because there's no other institution like Stanford. There's no other institution which exists to literally whitewash an ill-gotten fortune and is run by one old person whose ideas are going to determine what goes on campus.
It's like Liberty University. It's corollary.
Well, hopefully not. Okay, but up until your last comment, Francine, I was like completely with you, and then you lost me. But I think what you're saying is it rings so true, because I remember, about the whole nouveau riche kind of milieu, that kind of feel to the whole founding and all that. And I remember the band, the Stanford Ellis Jum band, like making fun of that whole thing, and the whole, junior Leland Stanford Jr., being part of it, like it just really playing with the whole story of the family and the money aspect of it, and the California gold, like the nouveau riche, riches, all that kind of stuff. And the band really using that in all of their lyrics and really poking fun at it. And I remember that aspect very clearly of like, oh, wow, like we are in a very different place than we would have been if we had gone to the Ivy League, to the Harvards and Princetons.
Or Berkeley.
Yeah.
Or Berkeley.
Definitely. Definitely not Berkeley. Let's not even talk about Berkeley, please.
Right.
Just kidding.
Richard, I'm curious, have you done any poking around into the founding fortunes behind Harvard, Yale, and Columbia?
Well, that's the interesting thing. All of these universities are looking at their origins. But Stanford has a problem. I mean, it's pretty easy for Princeton and Harvard and Yale to go back and say, we were involved in slavery. Slavery is bad. We shouldn't have done that. And to make some sort of reparations to all of it. That's all in a distant past. Stanford's problem is different. We're involved in people making fortunes whose origins is best not to look at, trying to then create a university in their midst. And the university is actually named after the dead child. Are we going to disavow that? I don't think so. It's much easier to turn on David Starr Jordan, who certainly deserves being turned on. But David Starr Jordan, they turn on because of the eugenicist. And that part is, they were all eugenicists. It's like Casablanca. I'm shocked. There's a eugenicist running the biology department here. So they get rid of David Starr Jordan and just sort of wash their hands of it. But meanwhile, there's all this other stuff that really bears some looking into that they have no intention, I think, of looking into. And the irony is.
And Richard, the current corollary is Stanford's very cozy relationship with Silicon Valley. And all of the funding that has been brought in the past 20 years, that the whole Elizabeth Holmes saga is representative of that, of Stanford aligning itself with enormous money, and that's actually stripping its scholars in freshman and sophomore year to be fodder for the tech, revolution. And I find that corollary really interesting because it is the present Gilded Age, and Stanford's right there. And I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, Stanford's not only right there, Stanford has helped create it.
Absolutely, completely.
And Stanford also owns stock in those companies. At one point when I was about, people would, at the end of my career before I became emeritus, when people would ask me what I did, and I said, I teach at Stanford University, a wholly owned subsidiary of Stanford Incorporated. And that really is what Stanford does. Stanford has a great deal of wealth, owns stock in these companies. So it's not as if they're over there and putting money in. It's no different from Leland Stanford and Jane Stanford. The Stanford fortune was Stanford University, and it was also the Southern Pacific Railroad. Drawing the distinction.
Totally the railroad, right, exactly.
Yeah, but all those Gilded Age fortunes, most of them were founded on shaky enterprises. I mean, there certainly wasn't a code of ethics involved in, driving railroads west or for trapping. I mean, look at the Vanderbilts, where they got their money. And, I guess it's really the Astors I'm thinking of. But nonetheless, most of our great fortunes in this country came from questionable practices by our standards today.
Well, there were questionable standards by their standards. I mean, one of my famous historical quotes, which is by Charles Francis Adams, who also was one of the Adams, Henry Adams and John Quincy Adams and John Adams, but he also was a railroad president. And at the end of his career, when Jay Gould forces him out of the Union Pacific, he says that, he was glad to go, that over the course of his career, he had met a whole bunch of people who were very rich and very well known, and not one of them would he ever care to see again in this life or the next, that they were utterly uninteresting, mere money getters, and people who pretty much broke any rule of God or man. So the time, Leland Stanford was not heroic, and for the own time. I'm sorry, I have to get rid of these people again. Okay, they're gone for a while. So that, the kind of thing is sometimes they say, well, they had their standards, we have ours. They violated their own standards. These were people that if you followed through in a lot of this stuff, they would have been in jail. And most people in California did not really admire them. Leland Stanford and Big Four were hated in California. Daily life is really intruding.
It really is. This is fun.
Francine, do you wanna just mute?
Sorry.
You can just mute.
I am
while-
so sorry. I'm putting the dogs in my bedroom.
Richard, I'd love to know, okay, so this sort of going back to this whole issue of what is the genre of, this tale, this very fascinating tale. Like, did you and your publishers talk about, how you market this? Like, is it as a very much of a true crime, like tale that is now finally being solved, that type of thing? I realize that it's, other people have weighed in earlier, or like, part of history and sort of analysis of academia and, and all of that sort of stuff. Because I can see all of these facets. And it would be interesting to me to sort of, I wish I could have been like a fly on the wall as you and your editor or publisher were discussing how you, like how you categorize your book and how you market it, and like what's the way that you try to get interest in, in this very fascinating tale.
My editor came around. my editor was not at all eager to have this be true crime.
Okay.
He thought by making it true crime, I would lose my usual audience and not gain any other audience.
Right.
So he came around in the end. And the other thing was because around my brother Stephen, as I began to realize that, this is, as much as I might resist it, really a mystery at the core of it,
Right.
and really going to be a cover up. And if that's true, then there are a whole bunch of writers who have been doing this for over 100 years, and there's no need to reinvent the wheel. That pretty much the way you structure a book, the way the length of the chapters, these kinds of things are things that really I should adopt. And I did. So in the end, I was reading, I read a variety of things. I read true crime. I read, what my brother Stephen calls crime fiction. I read old detective stories, and simply because he was writing in San Francisco at a little after the time I was writing about San Francisco, Dashiell Hammett, and these kinds of things for a flavor of what this place was like. So, it was a fight, but I think in the end we got a hybrid book, and it's always hard to say. It's neither fish nor fowl.
Right.
It is true crime, but it's also a history, and so that'll be interesting to see what the end reaction is going to be.
But it's actually called, Richard, it's actually called narrative nonfiction, which is one of my favorite hybrid terms. And the good news, Angie, is that Richard is being published by W.W. Norton, which is a smaller and private still publisher. And so the big corporate stuff that would go on in one of the major publishers, the big five, possibly soon to be the big four, wouldn't apply. I think it would be difficult to publish this book in a different house, but Norton likes to do this kind of thing. And we've kind of gotten away from narrative nonfiction, but it was really popular maybe 10, 12 years ago. There was a ton of it, maybe even 20 years ago. Time is beginning to fade on me, because
My mentor, John McPhee.
That's what I was
My
about to
mentor,
mention.
John McPhee.
Oh yeah, McPhee is great. Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
the idea is that, the foundations of the story are true, but the telling of it is narration, is fiction. And it's a nice marriage, of
it's akin to historical fiction in a way, except it's obviously more tied to the historical elements. So that's, that's of a lot of interest to people who really care about authenticity and things like that as well. So I think I can't wait to see how it plays out in the public eye, for sure.
Oh, what are your thoughts?
In the end,
You're a novelist. How would you have told this story?
Oh, are you talking to me? Who are you talking
I'm
to?
asking Paul.
Talking to.
Oh,
I
would have attempted to tell it just as Richard did. You did, and obviously there are no spoilers in this group. There was a lot of foreshadowing. as to your suspicion as to the ultimate suspect, and that was put in very, very nicely. So when you get to the end, you say, well, I hadn't thought of that necessarily, but I'm not astonished. And that's really a very effective way to build that up. I was just so impressed, and you, Richard, as an historian, were just so offhand about, said, well, this was archival research. I'd be curious to know what the research for this was like for you. I know you had your students in a class do some initial work, but I got the feeling from reading it that there was an awful lot of hands-on work and a lot of Sitzfleisch is what Julius Goebbels would call it, involved in putting all of these facts together and painting the very rich picture that you did. What was it like?
Well, in the end, it's what historians do. I sat down among large folders and boxes of documents and began to go through them. And the one where I knew I hit a gold mine was when I found the George Crothers papers, because the George Crothers papers, historians are messy. When you go through a file, the papers are out of order, they're upside down. And I got the George Crothers papers, and it was like a new deck of cards. Nobody had looked at this stuff. And George Crothers was the guy who knew where all the bodies were buried, and he had a lifetime of writing memos. And so around this, he wouldn't always tell me things, but he'd tell me where to look. And so the Crothers papers became a key. The Jordan papers were the same thing. One of the things I noticed about the Jordan papers is a lot of them are pure chronological order, a letter here, a letter there, a letter here. And then there are these other files where stuff had been pulled out. The stuff that had been pulled out are the critical things. Why was this document removed? I mean, one of them was going to be a letter from Chinatown, which was an attempt to set up one of the suspects' wing before Jordan decided to shut the whole thing down. It's in its own separate file. So going through the archives is, for a lot of historians, if you don't love the archives, it's really hard to be a historian. Being a historian amounts in the end to reading other people's mail. And it's true they try to cull the stuff, and the Stanford documents were heavily culled. But the more you cull it, the more clues you have. I mean, we're having an example of this going on in hearings that'll resume tomorrow. It is really hard to destroy evidence. There is always going to be traces. And when things vanish, that's the part that sets me on the trail. Wait a minute, that should be here. People say it existed. Where is it now? And the other thing, especially with some of the suspects, especially with Bertha Berner would lie. They all would lie. And in the beginning, I was sort of like a dog after a bone. They lied. I went to prove they were lying. And I realized the lies weren't the important thing. The important things were the things they didn't talk about at all. Those are the things that began to become critical to me. Things I knew had happened, and you go through these sources and nobody is mentioning it. So the archives were an adventure. I spent about 3 years, which is a short time for me in this book, on the archives. And then the others, like Goebbels' papers, which end up in the Library of Congress for good reason, because he didn't want Stanford destroying them. So that's the kind of stuff that happens.
Were these, is the archives at Stanford? Is this
archives at Stanford, and the archivists were wonderful. They were very cooperative, except, modern archivists, somebody at some point purged papers, but it wasn't the people who work in the archives now. It wasn't modern archives, but all kinds of things. The autopsy, the second autopsy has disappeared. The Jenny Lathrop's account of her aunt, Jane Stanford's letters in life has disappeared. Things that I knew were there are gone. I still have never found them.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow.
So what you're describing, Richard, is actually the process that every detective goes through. I mean, that's what's fascinating about this. Historians are detectives in their own right. And what you've constructed is case, but you do that every time you write an historical monograph. You just do it more subtly.
Yeah, but that's true. But remember, the thing that sets me apart from all of you guys, from your books that I've read, is when you have detectives, they want to solve the crime. I had no detectives who wanted to solve the crime.
Yeah.
They were police detectives or private detectives. They were hired to cover up the crime. That's what they were there for. So all of you can create a sympathetic hero because you can make things up. I did not have that person. There was nobody interested in solving this crime at all.
Wow.
And today it would be very difficult to challenge. So, you know, it would, Patrick, come and join us in case we have any questions or comments you want to make, in case the audience is engaged at all. You never know.
I think you've wowed them. I don't have any questions. I'm curious about more of the spiritualist angle. Did you find some interesting material there when you researched it?
Oh yeah, Stanford went out of its way to deny Jane Stanford remained a spiritualist, but its own archives are full of things they're called apports. When spirits appeared to mediums in the 19th and early 20th century to prove that they were really coming from the spirit world, they would bring things like artifacts from Mesopotamia or ancient Egypt to show that they could time travel through the things and get material objects and bring them back. There's a whole collection of apports up there. Thomas Welton Stanford would have the kind of thing where there's spirit writing. They would write messages from the dead, usually in chalk, and they had all kinds of protections. Those chalk things exist now. Thomas Welton Stanford kept track of a whole history, including interviews with Leland Stanford Jr. So if you ever wonder what ghosts talk about, go to the Stanford archives. It's all in there.
Was there a Theosophists chapter there at Stanford?
There wasn't a Theosophist chapter, which is a question I've had several times. That seemed to be more Southern California, which doesn't mean she didn't talk about it, but she mostly had her own set of mediums, including Bertha Berner, was reputed to be a medium. And of course, Thomas Welton Stanford was one of the most, her brother-in-law was one of the most famous spiritualists in the world at the time. And his medium was the same medium that worked for Arthur Conan Doyle, who was also a spiritualist.
Wow.
There really is
Major
a little
scam.
something for everybody in this book.
So fun.
Well, there really is. And, you know, I think it's a fascinating story that really, if you just made it up, it would be very hard to believe, which is why I think narrative nonfiction works so well for this. I mean, you know, if you tried to create this as a novel, I think you'd be met with a lot of disbelief.
Yeah, no, it's the oldest cliche in the world. The truth is stranger than fiction. In this case,
No, it really is. We were talking. I was with two other novelists 3 days ago, at Bookhampton, doing a book event, and we were actually talking about the fact that sometimes the plausibility issue in fiction is really hard to get around, because you can say all you want, but this actually happened. Yeah. But that's not good enough in fiction. You know, actual this actually happened is not, you have to actually make people believe it, which is very different from it actually happened. So that's actually, sometimes you have to turn to nonfiction in order to get to the more bizarre things that, you know, are really not plausible.
Well, Francine has written a number of books that are based upon real things, but, you know, interpreted by her as a novelist. I think Jack 1939 is absolutely brilliant, because Francine actually tries to figure out what was the health issue for JFK, which I thought you presented extremely well.
Well, I think
don't
it's
you
actually
think a novelist can do a better job sometimes with that than an historian?
Well, but it's different. It's the what if questions that sometimes throw themselves at you, the filling gaps in history, which is really, really fun. And I've certainly exploited, but I agree with Angie that there is this sort of barrier that fiction writers feel when you recognize that the suspension of disbelief is just too high, that hurdle is not going to be met when you go to write this particular book. You know, I think that somebody who writes historical fiction runs into that quite often, because sometimes you'll find a moment in history when you look at it and you say, oh my God, I can't believe this actually occurred. I think we're living through one. But, you know, anyone who attempts to write about it will be tackling a level of disbelief that's difficult to surmount, you know. And I think happily that in Richard's case, this case of Jane Stanford, there is a trail that he follows and sets up, and what I found interesting was that so much of the history you indulge in, Richard, whether you're talking about the Chinese community in San Francisco or you're talking about the internecine academic warfare at Stanford, you're creating the basis for suspects. It's very subtle, but it's very, very solidly done, so that as we follow the narrative of Jane Stanford's murder through the book, we have this immense context to say, okay, I understand why a particular academic would be, invested in her end, or why a Chinese laborer in her home would be invested in her end, or why her female companion would hate her enough to want to, kill her. I mean, it's interesting to see the way you build the case as an historian rather than as a mystery novelist. So I certainly benefited from the book.
I have a quick question about, does William Randolph Hearst figure into this story very much?
By then, William Randolph Hearst is gone to better things in New York. One of his editors figures into it. One of his editors on the Examiner, and it's one of my favorite incidents in the book, because of all the violence and because of all the lying in San Francisco newspapers, needs a bodyguard. So he hires Wyatt Earp, who's in town to run horses at the park that Leland Stanford founded, but he's lost all his horses. He's a terrible gambler. And he hires Wyatt Earp as his bodyguard, and the description on the San Francisco Examiner payroll is library attaché. So his library attaché is armed and always protecting him. And as I found out, you needed a bodyguard to be a newspaper editor in San Francisco. They were being shot, sometimes by each other. They're being beaten up on the streets. They're being kidnapped. San Francisco was a pretty wide open town in the early 20th century.
Well, it was. And, there's an act of God that intervened in all of this story, which was the San Francisco earthquake. You have to wonder, without the earthquake, how things would have been different. You see the picture of the campus reduced to rubble in various places, and you recognize that whatever else was going on in San Francisco was blotted out by, this enormous catastrophe. And things could be plausibly lost. There are a bunch of novelists, that have written stories about 9/11, whether, people who died or faked their death or whatever. Anytime you have an immense event like that, there are all kinds of stories that can result from it, because it derails history and it derails people's lives in a way that you can't do without it.
Yeah.
And it bears evidence.
Let me ask, Barbara, you raised a great question. What would have happened if there hadn't been an earthquake? What would have happened to this story? And to make it purely ahistorical, Richard, what do you think would happen if all of the events that you described transpired today rather than in 1905? With there not being a 6-day trip between here and Hawaii, with communication being what it is, with the press having changed in its attitudes, would things have been different today?
That's a very good question, and what I'm going to do is draw the obvious analogies, but not know, in fact, if that's going to help how it turns out. We're going through a time where, as far as I'm concerned, everything that happened in a disputed event is wide open for the public to look at. But what we seem to have is a little under half of the public still doesn't believe what is revealed. So if you are able to get information, because as an academic, the way I evaluate it is clearly not how most Americans evaluate it. I think what you would do now is you would have somebody begin to spin the Jane Stanford murder very, very quickly. You would begin
She'd have died
to
of
have,
a fentanyl overdose. She'd have died of fentanyl.
yeah,
She'd have died of fentanyl, and it would have been viewed as, tainted drugs, and she'd have had to have it, and that would have been the end of it. She would not have been murdered.
yeah. I think what they would have arranged is much the same kind of thing. It was some kind of natural or unfortunate death, or she was old. But that's the part that also got me involved in it right away. Was Jane Stanford, for the time, was quite elderly. She was in her late 70s. So why something had to be pushing somebody really quickly to get her to go? If all it was to die and get the money, just be patient. As I talk to my 4-year-old granddaughter, just be patient. This is clearly going to happen. Something set this off, and that's what got me thinking about it.
Yeah.
Well, it's been a fascinating topic, guys, and thank you very much for spending all this time with us. I really was so glad Francine and Stephen White, who's Richard's brother and a wonderful novelist, that I miss his work because he was much a part of our lives for over 20 years, I think, when we started the store. But I'm glad they pushed me to read this. And I'm really delighted that you were all able to read it and join in. There's so much to be learned from this book, really. For novelists, there's a lot to be learned, I think. And for all of us, my husband told me a little while ago that the Republican Party has actually adopted as part of its platform that the election was overturned. And I think, how is that even possible? When every single test of the election has failed to produce any fraud, how is it possible for a major political party to make it a platform issue that it was,
Barbara, it's
I
just
just can't, disinformation has a power today that is just almost inconceivable.
Yeah, it makes covering up the Stanford murder a pretty minor act. So,
well, it's covering up, it's one man's inability to admit that he lost or willing to give up power that has caused this whole thing to go on. And then you could spin it about Putin too. Why is he fighting a war so he can stay in office till he died? So I mean, it's interesting that it's played out at the university level. It's also playing out on a world stage level as well. This desire to cover things up.
That's always just covering up murder. I think covering up murder has been going on since
forever.
Who knows when? Yeah, and since way before then. But it's really interesting because it's obviously touched all of our our lives, even if we didn't even know it. That's the interesting thing.
Barbara, what you're really talking about at base is the big lie, right? And it's not just Biden. It's not just what we're witnessing here. It's Putin invading Ukraine and saying that he's defending against attack. It's the whole inversion of truth and selling it as truth. The lie. And that's really disturbing because it's operating on multiple levels worldwide right now.
Well, if we survived it at the end of the 19th century, we have to hope we're going to survive it in the early 21st century. I think it's a major question. In any case, Richard, I think your book is fabulous. So thank you very much for writing it. And I thank all of you for joining us this evening.
Barbara, thank you for
buy a
doing
copy
this.
of The Poison Pen, but you can buy a copy of it anywhere. And I'm truly hoping that we are going to see new books. I know we're going to see one from Francine on November 1st, but I hope that both Angie and Professor Goldsmith will also be giving us a new book sometime in the new year. And Richard, now that you're an emeritus professor, I hope you're moved to write something else.
I
you wrote it when you weren't an emeritus professor, so you surely can write one now that you are. Anyway, good night, everybody. Thanks so much.